game changer in terms of building a more just, sustainable, equitable, democratic society. So I'm just going to keep it that short and welcome Blair.
Don't evaluate my technological prowess based on the AV setup here. This isn't mine. I'm using the facilities AV stuff, so I'm working with it as well as I can. But we'll improvise and we'll kind of make it work. So thank you for having me into your space and giving an opportunity to kind of have a conversation. I'm gonna blow through some material pretty quickly so that we'll have a chance to unpack it with Q&A and the like at the end. If you want me to slow down, just raise your hand. I don't have a specific clock, but if I just kind of talk through each slide, we'll be here for 2 hours as opposed to 45 minutes. So I'm gonna go through it intentionally quickly, and so kind of make mental note of anything you want to unpack, and then we can dive into it from there. And so kind of the TLDR version of this, the kind of Cliff Notes summary version, is that we're attempting to manage major interconnected systems at the community level, globally, etc. And they're all kind of showing many signs of kind of deep distress and breakdown. Whether we're talking about political systems, ecological systems, climate systems, political systems, water systems, we could kind of go on and on, right? And so we've degraded the capacity of the systems to function naturally on their own. And we've also diminished our capacity, both individually and collectively, to steer these systems. We seem to be both more knowledgeable and more naive than we've ever been. I know in academic circles they talk about learning more and more about less and less until eventually you know everything about nothing. We kind of seem to be getting to that point in being hyper-specialized in all sorts of nuances and aspects of the way global supply chains work and a lot of other things, but are losing a perspective about how the whole system works, how the systems are interconnected, and how they impact us. And so, what does that have to do with makerspaces? We're trying to use digital fabrication and things like makerspaces as a means to allow more people with a higher collective intelligence to participate in the process of guiding us through these transitions. So keep that as a backdrop as we're kind of going through this. Right? And so, kind of quickly, my background. This is landscape architecture and regional planning.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm not in either one of those. So just to clarify ahead of time, if I say something stupid about both, it probably was stupid. Don't read too much into it. I'm obviously not going to try to speak to those areas specifically, but I have been forced to overlap on that a little bit. So really quickly, my background is electrical engineering, computer science, and complex systems. That's my formal training. I also have a multi-generational kind of family history of activism and institution building. I've got some deep history in a place that we're working in now. My family's been operating there for over 100 years. So a sense of place is very important to me. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've done startups and taken them public on stock market, and I've done startups in the public sector also. And I've recently had a kind of intense immersion in the public sector. So I'm currently my township's planning commission secretary, was the chair, the zoning board of appeals secretary, the board of review chair. I was on the transition team for the clerk, and an ongoing assistant to the township clerk. I'm on the county planning commission, I'm on the county economic development alliance. So I have swerved into the general area of planning as a rank amateur, doing the best I can, but we have also gone through and done a lot of kind of training. So done training in all of the elected positions in the township: supervisor, treasurer, clerk, trustee, most of the appointed position, master system planner, zoning administrator certificate, etc. In addition to a bunch of best practice training. So I might know some words that I might throw out, but as I said, don't put too much credibility in it, because this has been over the last 2 years that all of this has occurred, and this has occurred so that we can create the conditions by which community production can flourish in the communities that we're working in. And so instead of beating our head against the wall, an immovable wall, we decide to break the wall down. So we become part of government, we become part of the process for creating the conditions by which these types of community activities can actually happen. And I'm happy to unpack that because we've done a lot of political work, including 2 recall campaigns, one of which was successful, the other one is in progress right now and is looking to be successful. So we've gone to whatever extent necessary to allow the people in the community to have the representation they need to create the plans and the conditions that are necessary to allow ground level work to happen. So that's the quick kind of background. And I did this as much so you know what not to listen to from me as to what to listen to from me. So one of my organizations is Incite Focus, and it is a center for community production. And that incorporates a makerspace and a specific type of makerspace, which is a fab lab. And a fab lab is just a makerspace, but it's kind of carefully curated so that the right combination of technologies are in place to not only be able to do the things that we're trying to do right now in terms of making, but we have the ability to make the next generation of making stuff. And so it kind of spun out of the MIT Center, Bits and Atoms. There's about, 1,900 fab labs around the world right now. And so I'm an instructor in the Fab Academy, which kind of teaches those technologies, and I'm also on the board of the Fab Foundation, which is one of the anchor organizations that kind of oversees the Fab Lab network. How that happened, I'm not quite sure, but I serve with honor, and I try to do my best in the process of working that. So, start with a little bit of a problem statement. We usually start out with kind of a representation of donut economics. Anybody here familiar with donut economics? Okay. I was going to say anybody not familiar, and usually people don't say they're not familiar, but I got like 2 hands to familiar. So let me cover this for a real split second, not to get into the details of it. But the concept is that there's an outer boundary, which are the planetary boundaries that we live within. And they have a certain rate of regeneration. And if you exceed that rate, then you're degrading the planet, you're degrading on the ecosystems that we depend upon to live. Air quality, water quality, biodiversity, all of those things are part of planetary boundaries. The inner boundary are the social foundations, the thing that everybody should be entitled to. Food, water, education, employment, those kind of things, right? The idea of donut economics is that you should live within those 2 boundaries. You should not have people below the floor of the social foundation, and you should not be exceeding the planetary boundaries, which leads to discretion. So a donut is the sweet spot. Sweet donut. So the graph that's there is a few years old, and it's gotten worse, but the red is moving outward is where we've exceeded the planetary boundaries. And the red moving inward is where we're deficient in terms of providing people globally with the minimum social foundation. And the social foundation is basically based on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And so that's a kind of quick reference point that we kind of use and discuss, and that philosophy guides a lot of our work. In that we have to do things that have the ability to not prevent future generations from having the same opportunity that we have. So we cannot exceed planetary boundaries and destroy the environment that we're dealing with. At the same time, me living large is not sufficient if that comes at the cost of 1,000 other people not having the minimum things necessary in life. So it's a matter of equity for future generations, it's a matter of equity currently. So that's our framework of kind of working with things. And we're far away from that, as the quick overall graph shows. If you're curious, obviously, you all are experts at doing web searches. Donut economics is a fascinating area to kind of take a look at, and there's a lot of good kind of summaries of that. So, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about processes of change, collapse, sustainability, etc. And there is one called kind of the three horizons model. And it came out of research around innovation and discontinuities in innovation and how it's introduced to environments and how the environment kind of responds to it. But it matches up with some similar theories about rise and falls in civilizations. Cliodynamics is an interesting area of research that kind of deals with that. The basic idea is that there is a status quo. You know, we live in an environment right now that has certain governmental systems, that has certain economic systems, which seem like they're cast in concrete, but our current economic system has not been around but that long over the history of mankind. There was something before that. You know, there's slavery preceded what we're doing right now, feudalism preceded, there's a whole bunch of things that we've gone through. There's nothing to say that what we're doing right now is what we're going to be doing for the next 1,000 years. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of reasons to believe that it will evolve from where it is right now. And so you have a status quo in a lot of different areas. And that's the kind of H1, the horizon one. Generally, things reach a peak, they start to falter, and then they decline, and something else replaces them. And so the H3 is kind of what the eventual replacement will be. It's kind of, you know, whatever the new system is that replaces the current one. And if we knew what that is, we'd be in the process of replacing it currently. So there's a bit of a knowledge gap between H1 and H3, and those are the crazy people in the H2 area that are experimenting with innovations that may get sucked into H3 and, you know, that are proving the way forward. And a lot of what we're working with in the context of community production, digital fabrication, etc., are some concepts that we think are Horizon 3 concepts. And we're out working in Horizon 2 right now to prototype those and to see how they work. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Club of Rome. That were a group of folks who started modeling kind of the way the world would progress. I think it was in the late 70s or so. But, you know, when computer simulation first really started coming along, they did a ton of modeling on all our industrial systems and whatever. And the outcomes looked very ugly, and they kept changing parameters, and the outcomes still looked about the same. And that's basically, if you keep exponentially consuming resources in a finite space, eventually you're going to hit a wall and it crashes. The timing may change, it may be a gentle crash or maybe a steep crash, but it happens. And we are seeing a manifestation of that at this point in time. This version of the three horizons is the nice version that people would like to see happen. That's not the only version that could occur. The variant 1, which is collapse and recovery, is kind of what Club of Rome had modeled. And there are many, many civilizations. I'm not the historian, but folks talk about the rise and fall of many civilizations over a period of time. And folks are starting to talk about the rise and fall of the one that we're in the middle of right now, because it's showing signs of difficulty. And so the collapse may be a steep one. And it may be the fact that Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 do not pick up fast enough to carry the weight when Horizon 1 falls. Which means a lot of people who are at the margins of society, or a stronger statement would be a lot of people who are not in the mainstream of society, will be very significantly impacted if our current system stops providing a constant stream of goods and services to everybody because of some systemic failures. A lot of people who are not highly resourced will be very catastrophically affected at that point in time, because the vast majority of us do not have the means of providing for ourselves anymore. Maybe 4 or 5 generations ago, most folks could hang in there and do stuff. Through depressions, through whatever, people participated in building their houses, people had gardens, they grew food, and a bunch of other stuff. The vast majority of us do not have that knowledge or capability or the necessary resources anymore. So if there was a disruption in things at this point in time, a lot of people would be adversely affected very quickly. And so that collapse is something that we are trying to find a way to ease. And so there's another variant 2, which we're also trying to avoid, which is you come up with a good innovation in this new disruptive arena, and it gets hijacked and sucked into preserving the existing status quo. That happens a lot at this particular point in time, and as folks who are trying to do systems change, we are actually trying to effectively bring a new system into existence without causing catastrophic disruptions for people who are relying on the existing system. So, a bit of background, all right? There's a lot more that can be said about that, and if you want me to kind of unpack that more in Q&A, I'd be happy to. But that's kind of an overview. We also have a situation where the American dream isn't really much of a factual statement. The whole pull yourself up from your bootstraps and everybody has the ability to achieve anything really isn't a reality. The studies that have been done are related to income mobility across generations. In most developed countries, including the United States, it takes a full 5 generations for somebody in poverty to just move up into an average income level. And as most of you know, as time has gone by, an average income level is not a prosperous income level. The concentration of wealth at the high end has not provided a lot for folks in the middle. So if it takes 5 generations to go from poverty to average, and average is insufficient, there's not a lot of social mobility available in our society, right? Given the way things are structured. We'd like to provide some different mechanisms for changing that. So, none of these are radically new things. People have been talking about these things for a while. Talked about new economic systems, new political systems, a lot of things. Our existing system is very well structured, it's very well tuned, and it's not easily disrupted, which is why it's persistent as long as it has. And so it takes some radically new capabilities to begin to even think about changing the way these patterns kind of work. And so one of those practical tools is digital fabrication. You probably figured out eventually we get to this, so I'm here. So digital fabrication isn't just about 3D printing. Digital fabrication is fundamentally about changing the way we fabricate things from high-tech whittling and carving, an analog process, to a digital process. And we've seen digital revolutions before. Well, a lot of you haven't. I'm old enough to have seen a couple of these digital revolutions before, like on the phone calls, communications. I mean, I remember a point in time where the farther away the person you called, the more static there was on the line, because it picked up more noise as it went along. That's not the case anymore because communication is digitized and you can transfer bits without error and it works perfectly. And that's enabled a tremendous amount of supply chain management and a lot of other things that are going on right now. There was also a change in analog to digital in computation. First computers were actually analog with gears and the like. As a lot of advanced technology, it was developed to help blow up things more efficiently. It was for ballistic calculations, for targeting things. But it was a whole lot better than doing it by hand. However, the longer it ran, the less accurate it became. And so there was a transformation in computation to digital computers. And digital computation can be very repeatable and don't pick up accumulation of errors as they go along. There's a lot to the whole analog versus digital and threshold theorems and a whole bunch of other stuff, which I love to talk about. So if you want to corner me on that, feel free. Digital fabrication, we're talking about basically a summary transformation. Going from a very analog process of carving or squirting or adding material to one that has the precision, reversibility, and the like of other kind of digital technologies. And so there's a lot of ways to do that, and 3D printing is sort of a hybrid of digital and analog. You're still melting and squirting stuff, but you're doing it with some degree of digital control. So we're in the middle of a rapid advancement in digital fabrication. So we started at a point where, the computer started out with one gigantic computer, took up a major part of the building. And digital fabrication kind of started with one of those massive computers hooked up to an almost equally massive machine tool. Again, for the purpose of building airplane parts to blow up stuff. This is a reoccurring theme, but we want to hijack some of the technology for some other purposes also. But, you had, kind of started out with one of these, they were, on the order of $1 million each. And you kind of transitioned from computers to that, one-of-a-kind building-size things to mini computers, which I'm old enough to remember. You had, took up part of a room, but a group of people could actually access it and do useful things with it. And those were, there's a few thousands of those, and they were on the order of $100,000. And, that was way before personal computers, or way before iPhones, or way before, Apple Watches. But there's a huge transition that happened from mainframe computers, which is at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, to the thousands of computers at a community level, in that a lot of the things that we're familiar with in terms of amazing digital technologies, whether it's spreadsheets and word processing, the internet, digital encoding of audio and video and all that kind of stuff, were developed by people on mini computers way before there were personal computers that are available to them. When people get a chance to put their hands on something and play with it, even if it's not on their person, they begin to innovate in ways that people who are trained in the technology of that thing didn't do. These are other people who wanted to use a computer to do something. When they could get their hands on one, they created stuff that computer scientists weren't thinking about because they weren't musicians, or they weren't artists or whatever. And so Fab Labs, makerspaces, are kind of at that community level right now. The order of $100,000. And people are beginning to be able to get their hands on technology and innovate in those spaces in ways that you wouldn't do in a company which has a sole purpose for that makerspace, or in a specific educational program that's narrowly aligned with making sure that people have the skills to deliver a specific output from their makerspace. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, that's an amazing capability to be able to propagate and move forward. But it's not all that the makerspaces and Fab Labs are good for. It's not just about the propeller heads and the whiz kids getting really good at using the technology to do something. It's about people who don't even know that they're interested in technology, being exposed to it, and then beginning to hijack it and do their thing with the technology as a tool, right? And so we're at that point, and it's an amazing point. But that's still fairly early on in the process. The history of computers is that after the mini computers came personal computers. The first ones weren't that fancy. You had some switches and some lights, and you flicked the switches and put in your code, and the lights blinked. But it moved forward, and now we've got personal computers that we use for all sorts of other things. But the Fab Labs are kind of moving into a stage where you can have, $10,000 Fab Lab and have millions of those around. And then that moves into a phase where we can have $1,000 fabrication technologies and have millions of those around. And then that'll move into a phase. So the process continues. And so what ends up along this line is that the ability to describe something in digital form will enable folks to have easy access to equipment to be able to turn that into a material form. And so as the price of fabrication starts going towards zero, and this curve is pretty well established right now. Some of you all may have heard of Moore's Law, when the whole computer thing, the number of transistors on the chip doubled every couple of years. That's no law of the universe. Some guy in the first 5 or 6 or 10 years of making transistors and integrated circuits noticed that this phenomenon was happening, and so he called it Moore's Law. And then every business person started saying, hey, we should keep this going, so let's write this in our business plan. And so it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The same thing's happening with digital fabrication. The number of labs, the cost of the lab, things are changing about every 18 months, is doubling. So they call it Lass's Law. And so it's not a law of the universe, but I see more and more people and more organizations writing that into their strategic plan, so it's happening. It's wind that's pushing it along. And so the ability to fabricate anything at almost negligible cost means that the only impediment is understanding how to describe what you want to fabricate. And one of the reasons that we're big on makerspaces at this point in time is that people getting involved in digital fabrication at the earlier phases allows them to begin to think about how to describe and innovate around things, so that when the technology catches up, everybody will be able to be user innovators. And that's a major democratizing force in the ability for people to use local resources that they have to produce the things that they need and not just be dependent upon global supply chains and economic mechanisms which may not be operating in their or their community's own best interest. So I just wanted to point that out, that there is a roadmap, and we're early on in the roadmap. And there are actually people all over the world doing these later stages right now. It's a running joke about, graduate students with tweezers are simulating some of these machines in some lab someplace, which is actually not a joke. I did a little bit of that myself in earlier generations of stuff, but I mean, this isn't a theory anymore. We actually understand how these stages work, and there's a timeline that it takes to commercialize some of these things, and so they're kind of in the pipeline. All right, so the idea is to create a scenario where we can live within our boundaries and provide for our needs. And that's centered around using the materials that we have, both in natural systems and in mechanical systems, more effectively. And about the only leverage point that's large enough to be able to do that effectively, that I and the folks that I've been working with have been able to discover, are these advancements in digital fabrication that are growing exponentially at this particular point in time. So, hence the interest in digital fabrication. So we have, taken our current level of technology. We work with, companies to prototype ideas or to do pilot production. We work with, literally kindergarten through college-age students in learning not only the skills of digital fabrication, but doing community-based projects where people can begin to work with other people, use the digital fabrication to create a product that didn't exist, but that they thought that the world needed. And so the majority of these people actually aren't interested in being digital fabrication experts. They're interested in bringing new things into the world. And they didn't know digital fabrication was the way to do that, but now that they do, they're all in on digital fabrication too. But it's a means to an end. They want to make a pop-up park for their community. They want to make tiny houses for homeless people. They want to make energy harvesting systems. They want to make equipment to harvest and process agricultural things, et cetera. We also, do work with people who know they want to be makers and, DIYers. We have people who use it who are starting up small businesses in different ways. Some of those are sole proprietorship, some of those are collaboration between multiple people under different kinds of business models. But it's a space where people can try out a business and grow it to the point where they've got a good business case to invest in equipment and use the shared equipment in the space to be able to do that. So that's kind of an example of kind of our space for our lab. Just to kind of give you an idea of some things that people do in Fab Labs. This is a very famous picture of a house that was developed in Barcelona. And there's some interesting aspects of this. There's a few Fab Labs that actually got together to produce this house. But there's some interesting aspects of the design team being able to actually come together and envision some different concepts. Like instead of form follows function, form follows energy. And so what would it look like if you actually created a structure where the form of the structure followed this necessity for energy harvesting and energy conservation? Usually you wouldn't have an idea to do anything but sketch something on a piece of paper and have somebody give you their opinion of whether it's a good idea or not. Having access to a Fab Lab allowed them to actually build it and implement it and test it and refine it and go forward. There's a world of difference between those two. When you talk about, regular people being innovators, these weren't exactly regular people. They were pretty good architecture students, but they weren't ones who would have normally been in a position to actually try out ideas like that. You can make electronics, circuit boards, you can make things like soles of shoes. This is in a whole larger area of fashion with a small f as opposed to capital F fashion, which is about doing things within the ethical framework that makes sense to you, using local materials that don't waste a lot of water and pollute the environment in different ways, kind of etc. You can make cube sets. This is really a marginal use, but everybody loves sets, so they make me keep this picture in here. But obviously the metal's coming from someplace else, et cetera, but you can actually fabricate things that allows you to send them up in somebody's rocket ship and collect and transmit data back to Earth for different reasons. Lots of things related to musical instruments and various forms of transportation. The picture in the top center is actually some folks in Afghanistan that didn't have a internet service provider, so they fabricated their own distribution network for the internet using basically chicken wire and some plywood, forming antennas and the like in order to make that work. And they used some very common off-the-shelf routers and reprogrammed them to be hubs in different ways, and actually set up a very good communications backbone that no one else was willing to do for them, but was critical for them. We have several educational programs that we offer, from the Fab Academy to a Maker Professional program, which is a registered apprenticeship program with the Department of Labor. We also kind of eat our own dog food, as they say. We fabricate our lab in our lab. So most of the furniture we have in the lab and architectural partitions and those kind of things are ones that we do. And that picture down in the lower left is actually energy neutral micro cabin, even in Michigan's winter weather, which has a full bathroom, kitchen, and the like in the space of probably 2 of your normal closets. And it's built to code compliance standards. So we actually went through the process of helping people understand how to build code compliant structures that are actually energy efficient and the like. We have many different people who operate in the lab from many different walks of life. And although we spend a lot of time and energy trying to predict who would be a likely customer, et cetera, we're also always constantly surprised because the most random person will come in and do the most amazing things. And the most amazing person on paper will come in and have no original ideas whatsoever. But, I mean, that's the nature in many fields, but it's a very interesting space because people get a chance to kind of figure out for themselves what are they really interested in. And the educational process in the labs is a kind of just-in-time process. So I want to do this, okay, I can teach you this now. You don't have to do 6 months of this, and then a year of that, and then a year of that. Now you can do that. We'll teach you enough of this to get it done, and then you're usually interested enough to say, okay, open the hood, how did that work? And then you kind of layer it that way. So it's a whole different kind of educational philosophy around it. So, as I mentioned, our community production consists of digital fabrication as one piece, but it's also about the natural environment. And so the most thorough way of saying that is basically we are looking to recapture an indigenous worldview of our relationship between ourselves and our relationship with the land that we're a part of. We're not looking to be good stewards. We're looking to be good components of an integrated system of which we are one part. And so that includes some things like agroecology, permaculture, regenerative agriculture. We have strong programs in all those areas also. So we kind of split things into the built environment, digital fabrication, natural environment, which are these components related to agroecology, permaculture, and again, kind of indigenous worldview. We also work with ways that people gain skills in digital fabrication and these other natural systems components can work together in small teams and self-organize and have the ability to kind of coordinate their activities and move forward. A lot of things like agile project management, et cetera, which allow people to maximize the resources they have, not waste them doing things that don't make sense, but experiment along the way, validate their ideas, and use their precious resources effectively, and also to collaborate in ways that don't waste people's time. So we kind of talk about the 3 legs of the stool being the built environment, the natural environment, and then the organizational and social systems are the 3 legs that kind of hold the whole process up. And a major part of what we're trying to do is to change people's relationship with jobs. And so there's a lot of ways to look at that, and I'll kind of point out a couple real quick ones. One is most people are completely emotionally and intellectually detached from the jobs that they do. I'm sure that's not the case for anybody in this room. But for a lot of people, a job is a way to earn a living. And so you do something for someone, you sell your time wholesale, the employer gets the markup on that as they sell, the service or the product at a retail level. After you sell your time wholesale, you pay taxes on it, and then you pay everybody else at their retail level rate to do all the things that you don't know how to do for yourself. If you think through a business model, selling wholesale and buying retail is not a winning strategy. However, for the one thing that's really most precious to us that we can't get any more of, which is our time, that's the pattern that we're locked into. What we're interested in doing is allowing people to use their time to create value for themselves and their family and their community directly. And having access to the means of production is a key way of doing that. Not just in producing things, but being able to innovate in things that you may not even continue producing. But if you have a viable idea, then that has some value that you can derive from it kind of going forward. And so a lot of folks talk about the difference between work and jobs. So we're talking about what in many lines of thought is new work. The structure of actually having work that is where you own your time and you have some discretion over what you're doing, and you have an ability to create a better return on your investment in time because you can put more of your creative talents into that, and because you're working on things which you're passionate about, which you'll naturally get better at, as opposed to buying time in order to do what's necessary to kind of think of a paycheck. So there's obviously a lot more than that also, which if you want me to unpack, I'm happy to talk about. And so this whole aspect of community capacity and us atrophying as individuals and as a community, I alluded to a little bit earlier, in that most of us are very myopically specialized. We've been kind of focused on doing that thing which is our core competency and becoming very good at it and earning money at it. And we've lost a lot of the perspective on all of the things in life that need to come together in order to have a prosperous life. I was talking with Emily earlier about diets and nutrition and vegan versus carnivore and some other things. And it just reminded me, out of all the species on the planet, people are the only ones who don't know what to eat. Cows know what to eat, ants know what to eat, birds know what to eat. People are the only ones who don't know what to eat. And we have to rely on the food industry to give us commercials to tell us what to eat, which is generally not the right thing to eat. That's a good example of atrophy in terms of our knowledge and our understanding of what it means to be human in a viable way. Sorry to pull you into this conversation, but all right, so we've done a lot of work, and I'll kind of wrap this up momentarily. We surveyed a lot of people in Detroit, South Africa, Ethiopia, Idlewild, a bunch of other places. We asked them to just do a monthly budget. I mean, so what do you spend money on? It's a fairly easy exercise. And the list is pretty consistent, right? You spend the majority of our money on these things. And then we take an additional step and say, okay, so, what's your wage rate? What's your earning power? So let's translate this into hours. How many hours do you spend for all of these things? And that just changes the nature of the conversation completely. Dollars are this abstract thing. You mean to tell me I'm spending 15 hours a week for this? And that's not even that important, right? So we have gone through and done this just from the perspective of understanding how we're allocating our time, but also to cause us to begin to kind of evaluate, is that a good trade-off of time? Because we're all hyper concerned about how much time that we have for the things we love to do or for family or whatever else. We don't have enough time. So when we reduce things to time, it's particularly important. There are other folks who have studied this from various different perspectives and various different specialties. And it's a fairly similar set of things. So we organize our efforts around being able to use our Center for Community Production to allow people to use the resources that they have in an indigenous context, the local resources that they have, et cetera, to be able to create the things that they need. Now, it might not be shiny and blingy and has spinny stuff on it or whatever, and that's a whole another part of the conversation, is that what have we been conditioned to want to show as status symbols to other people, and does that actually make sense? But the key thing is, if we can identify the things that are important and critical and focus on an ability to make those, then the other stuff, we have the discretion to think about whether it's a useful investment of time for that. We actually have some onboarding programs to kind of walk through just kind of basic survival, up through kind of prospering in an environment so that you can kind of strip out all the things you do every day and just kind of go to what does it actually take to keep my body healthy and to be in good community with other people, and then you can decide what else you want to add to that. It's kind of like if you're on a nutritional level, sometimes they'll put you on a cleansing diet or an elimination diet, just get rid of everything for like 60 days, and then start adding back one thing at a time and see how it messes with you, and then you know what you want to deal with or not. Similar kind of thing. Strip it back to its bare essentials for a few weeks, and then start adding back different things and see whether you think that's a useful investment of your time, given what it takes to continue to participate in that. So we're doing this kind of from a bottom-up perspective of, goods and access to the lab, and then literacy and services through the training, and then experiences through the DIY experience and other things that people like, and transformative experiences, walking people through the process of gaining a sense of agency in being an innovator around something that they thought only other people did. And then we're coming down from the top in terms of community development and the political arena and community infrastructure in different ways, which includes some of the social and economic systems and the institutions in economics. And we're looking to fill in that whole stack. We're, at this point in time, coming from two different directions and haven't met in the middle yet, but we're working in that direction. And that's me. And we also, for example, have a 61-acre campus in an interesting area of Michigan that we're in the process of building out into a resilience hub that'll have all of our stuff in the same place. The community production, the agroecology work, growing stuff for energy, growing things for fiber and building materials, growing things for food, being able to have the ability to value add process, all of those things. So we can grow some industrial hemp, we can turn that industrial hemp into fiber, we can weave that fiber into a textile, we can take the textile, turn it into a composite, and use that as a structural component. So, donut economics is interesting from a global perspective. It's hard to do a local version of donut economics because there's so many things that cross the barrier of what you're doing physically. However, you can look at whether you're operating within the carrying capacity of the land that you're on. And so that's kind of what our mindset is right now. We can understand exactly what crosses a barrier for 61 acres and doesn't. And so we can understand exactly what our impact is and how we can maximize our opportunity to use what's there. One aspect of, we also create software tools that allow you to get into digital fabrication without having to do 2 years of computer-aided design before you make anything, etc. All right, so that's the finishing off piece. And one of our kind of mottos is fight for what you want now or fight against what you don't want later. And that's real. So we're on the fighting for as opposed to fighting against, and we try to spend as much time as possible in that arena. I can pause for a second. In our last, I went a little bit longer than I thought, but you all talked a little bit at the beginning too, so I'm sure I'll go back to that. So let me open it up for feedback or questions. I got a couple other points I'd love to make, but let me pause for the questions.
That was very inspiring, thank you. Can you say a little more about what's on those 60 acres? I didn't quite catch, what is there existing? It looks like streets.
That was a couple different things that we're doing. The 60 acres actually is a forest. It was logged in the late 1800s, so it's regrowth forest, which is not optimal because you got all kind of stuff during the same span of their lifespan that are starting to crowd each other out at this point, but it is forest. So what we're putting in, we have a fab lab near there, and we're using that fab lab to actually build the fab lab that's going into that site. Putting in a pond, about a 4.5 acre pond, doing the integrated agricultural work there. And we're also putting in a nationally accredited, state licensed residential youth camp so that young folk can have an opportunity to kind of dwell in this space and this way of thinking for a period of time. We've done that before. We've done all of these things before in other places, but we realized that the synergy of having them all work together doesn't work. So we're bringing them all together in the same spot and having our resilient canvas that's basically there.
One thing that you said that resonated with me was accepting the collapse and trying to ease it. And I think I have a pretty good understanding already of how to ease that collapse with food sovereignty and local, all those, that side of it. But I'm curious how, from your perspective, how to ease that collapse through the technological development, through public policy work, and the other things that you have experience in that I haven't had experience in.
In our remaining 5 minutes, so let me kind of give you a couple of perspectives on that. Wonderful question.
Thank you.
There's an area of research called CLIO Dynamics, CLIO Dynamics. There's a book that just came out this year called End Times. It's not that kind of end times. It's about an analysis of rise and fall of states, civilizations, etc. And they've done a magnificent job of doing a lot of data collection and building a database over an extended period of time. In most recent history across the world, you've got a lot of data, but they pulled in specialists from a huge number of areas to come up with proxy measures of how certain things happened in the past. And then they run these theories about rise and fall and decline of civilizations in the form of a concrete model against those data sets to see whether these theories hold any water or not, and they're doing some extremely good work. They've come up with a couple of very poignant aspects of when things crash hard and when things crash more gently and what stimulates the crash. And there's a couple of things that they've done in the last year and a half related to the United States and our allies that are very eye-opening in terms of where we may be in the curve and how it's shaping up in terms of a harder or faster flow. So one of the things we look at is just from an overall perspective of what can we learn from history, because this has happened a lot before. There's a lot of theories, a lot of them half-baked over a long period of time. Nothing against historians, nothing against anthropologists, a lot of things against armchair theorists who haven't validated anything against anything, but I'm a systems dynamics person, I'm an engineer, so I fixate on a couple things, and I think the work that they're doing is very good. So we are heavily informed by that piece of things. What the models have shown when they are run against the data. And a lot of these models are ones that people have been talking about, but there's only like 2% of the ones that people have been talking about. They've been talking about another 98% of stuff which hasn't held up when you've compared it against how civilization have actually functioned. One of the things, so there are two major things that are coming out of that. One is popular immiseration and the other is elite overproduction. Popular immiseration is kind of what it sounds like. If people become too poor and too exploited by excess concentration of wealth, it destabilizes things in different ways. The elite overproduction is very interesting because it's not overproduction by elites, it's overproduction of elites. So when you have this situation where you have a huge concentration of wealth, you have too many people with too many resources fighting for too many seats of power. And they start working together, they start working against each other, they start working against everybody else, and that creates very hard crashes. It may sound familiar in our current context. One of the things that reverses that is by democratizing wealth creation and democratizing innovation, which leads to wealth creation. So one of the things we're interested in is having everybody have the ability to create value in their own local context. So we're not all paying and enriching a small group of people to be able to survive, who are then using that against us in obvious ways, but it's also working against us in indirect ways, and that is destabilizing the whole system, which is not something they're necessarily looking at, although some of them are and don't care. So we look at the big picture, and then we try to, it has validated our thoughts about how democratizing access to the real means of production can lead to a more graceful transition, or at least a more graceful decline into whatever it is that will emerge from there. Did that kind of address what you were asking?
It did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Blair, great talk. Reminded me of a theory of resilience, where you have like a system collapse and then regenerates, and so enable communities to kind of be prepared for something happening. Education, ecology, of course, too. So creating a flexible system where you say, well, through the fabrication, and your knowledge that you gain, people have more education and they're more prepared. They also have more, they're more stable, have more impact. Is that kind of
Yeah, no, I think
another
that's
interpretation?
That's absolutely another interpretation, and there's larger forces that are looking at the same thing. There's a proposal for a National Fab Lab Network, which is to make sure that there's at least one Fab Lab in every congressional district around the country. And